Claire HACKETT. Welcome to Féile and Phobail 2021, our virtual debate and discussion programme. And I have here with me Bill Rolston and Robbie McVeigh. We're going to be talking about your book, Ireland, Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution. You planned, I think, to have a book launch, but what we decided to do instead was have a talk about the book, really drill into some of the content in it. So I want to start by asking you, I know your central premise of the book is, or the argument is, that Ireland was and remains colonised, and that has implications for our understanding of the past and how we shape the future. That's the way I would sort of summarise it. I was struck by this one line that you have quite early in the book: Ireland does not have a history. It has an ongoing experience whereby the past is not yet over. Ireland does not have a history. Unpack that a bit further.
Slightly tongue-in-cheek, okay? History in common usage, common parlance, is a notion about the past. You know, what's that sort of joke definition of history? One damn thing after another, but all back there. And it's a little bit, I think, like the notion of in Palestine, where they say the Nakba didn't happen in 1948. Of course it did, but the Nakba is every day. So it's the notion that to talk about history, you give that impression that something is over and now you're in the post phase. But it's not over, because firstly, part of the island is still directly colonised. And secondly, the legacy or the implications of that colonisation run through every aspect of life, politics, economics, etc., on both parts of the island. Simply put, that's what we mean. It's still a live issue. And the other point we make near the start too is one that might surprise some people. I mean, I've talked to some Republicans and they've said, duh, you know, but not everybody sees the world the way Republicans do. My point is this, that an awful lot of academics, in fact, the vast bulk of academics, and probably most political commentators and politicians, if you say to them, is Ireland colonised? Is Ireland colonised? They would say no, it's a non-question. So part of what we're doing is to try to make it a question that deserves to be asked and deserves to be answered.
And I felt as well, one of the things you were saying early on in the book was that we actually need to understand this, and people need to understand this history that is not history, that is unfinished, in order, because this means something for the here and now.
No, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the striking thing about our experience is that when we started talking about doing the book, it was kind of, we really felt we were swimming against the tide with it. You know, that people, that we were, you know, the whole world wasn't a post-colonial situation, but Ireland was post-colonial with knobs on it. It was like almost bad manners to kind of talk about some of this history. Now, what's striking about our contemporary world is how much that has changed. You know, because both in terms of the dynamic around Black Lives Matter, it's, you know, the notion that America is still colonised or India is still colonised is hardly problematic anymore. Everybody's begun to engage with those questions about what are the continuing legacies of colonialism long after the formal colonial structures are removed, even, like I say, somewhere like the States or different African or Asian countries. So that dynamic's changed in our favour, if you like. I think it's much easier to have this conversation now. You'd be hard pushed to suggest that the legacies of colonialism aren't still there for us or for the rest of the world, for that matter. So that dynamic is interestingly live for us and in a really good way. But it is striking, like, you know, that, as I say, 5 or 6 years ago, it felt like we were ploughing a lonely furrow, and now, I think everybody in the world agrees with it.
Yes. Well, there's much more space.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this is one of the things that I have to say I really loved about the book, was that, in a sense, you know, notwithstanding what we said about we don't have a history because it's unfinished, but you do give the history of colonialisation, and that is that's the lens through which you analyse all of the events and everything, all the stages that have happened, and just to see it put in that way was really refreshing, I think. So you take a very, very broad sweep, you know, in that sense. So you also talk there about that kind of process, that arc of decolonisation, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. But I want to stick with this history, but can you tell me some of because you do describe this in the book, some of the key stages of colonialisation of Ireland.
Well, I suppose the interesting thing about Ireland is that it's often seen as being the first colony. So that whatever else we learn from Irish history, we see that a longevity of 800 years and growing that gives you a particular perspective on how this phenomenon works. It's just the length of that experience is striking in itself. But I suppose that, in terms of the broader context, one of the important things I learned out of doing it is if you really want to understand imperialism or colonialism, the point at which it's clearest, I think, is when different imperial or colonial powers operate together. And their classic example, like whenever the world was divided up between Spain and Portugal, it wasn't the Spanish doing that or the Portuguese doing that. It was colonialism doing it in a particular way. You see it later in terms of the Congress of Berlin when Western countries divide up the whole of Africa. Only 2 people at that conference had ever been in Africa, so the enormity of that, of the kind of racism involved in that stuff is clear. And then another classic example is the 8th Army attack on Beijing at the start of the 20th century, where you see a later colonial phenomenon, but it's 8 Western armies doing this and the Japanese. And at that point, it's not about one country doing something to another country. It's a much broader force.
Well, I have to say the book is packed with this kind of information, very intriguing bits that, I read that bit and I thought, I must read more about that, because that makes me think how China is being interpreted and reacted to globally now, and then there needs to be an understanding of that. Bill?
No, I just want to follow on to localise it a wee bit, which was part of your question here, to talk about, you talk about that arc, which we do in the book. You've got conquest, you've got consolidation, and then you've got decolonisation. Now, 3 phases and overlap often, but there's no magic formula which says how long each of these phases is or will be. Take the phase of conquest. Some cases, like take the conquest of Mexico by the conquistadors back in the day, that happened very suddenly. It happened partly through divide and conquer by the Spanish. But in the Irish case, 500 years after the Norman Knights laid claim to parts of Leinster, right? The English were still complaining that they couldn't conquer Ireland. They kept complaining in particular about this part of the world, which they called the very foster mother of all rebellion in Ireland. That's a quotation from somebody in the Elizabethan period. So in the Elizabethan period, they decided this phase, not said quite in our times, but this phase has gone on too bloody long. We've got to stop this once and for all. And they threw everything at it. They threw armies at it. They threw scorched earth policy and cruelty at it in ways that they weren't throwing into other campaigns that they've been doing. They threw money at it. Between 1598 and 1601, the British Exchequer spent about £2 million trying to pacify Ulster. £2 million of the time. It cost them more to intervene in Ulster than it did to fight the Spanish and the Armada and everything else. But to bring it home to what caused, or what copper fastened the conquest finally, was the one idea that they had in the late 1500s and finally got together: plantation. Plantation was the key to conquest. And that was here, it was tried other parts of Ireland, of course, quite a few other parts, but here is where it really worked as a counterinsurgency policy. Put the settlers in, let the settlers take the crap, right? Don't have to worry about an army because the settlers will defend themselves, just arm them and they'll defend themselves. And also, the benefit is that if it begins to work at all, the civilization of the settlers will begin to rub off on these nasty natives and they'll be educated into our ways. So, what's not good about it from a conquest point of view? So to me, that debate around that time about the failure of conquest and the notion that partition becomes a solution is crucial. That period, 1598, 1601, the death of Elizabeth, the coming to the throne of James.
Say a wee bit more about that, around partition, how that links to partition.
Did I say partition?
You did.
Excuse me, I didn't mean partition. Plantation.
Plantation.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
But partition is another kettle of fish.
Yes.
Maybe we want to leave that for a minute.
Just for now, yes,
Okay.
because I mean we will hop about a bit and stuff.
Okay.
But yeah.
Sorry for
Yeah.
misspeaking.
Although I think we do probably have to, there's such tragedy, I suppose, in the fact that Ulster, was such a rebellious and resisted conquest so fiercely.
This does go back to the longevity point, because you kind of, you're very struck when there's an awful lot of discussion going around the centenary of the Northern Ireland state at the minute. It's a lot of very interesting discussion, but it's interesting to go back and look at some of the debates that happened 100 years ago, and you kind of realise that some of the politics and a form of Protestant ascendancy, if you like, that was imposed after the formation of the state was precisely what had been tried twice before, if you go back in history. So you get these waves across the different stages of colonisation, or something that looks completely new, i.e. what the sort of politics of race and ethnicity in the context of the Northern Ireland state wasn't really that different from the forms that the independent Protestant Irish Parliament took in Protestant ascendancy 200 years before. So you see these patterns running through the history of Ireland and repeating, and that it becomes really intriguing then to try and locate some of the contemporary discussions that we're having in terms of that history.
There's one thing that I kept saying to you that struck me out of doing the research for the book. Do you remember at one point we were saying, name 5 things that we really got out of the book that we didn't know or didn't know to that extent before? And one that I picked was the notion of loyalism and what loyalism is about. And if you look at settlers and their descendants to this day, the fact that the loyalism is one way, if at all, that they never get the right reward for their loyalism. And you see it repeat over and over again. I mean, not just like sort of, fighting and dying in the First World War for motherland and everything else, and then not getting proper conditions of work, fighting in the working housing, fighting in the Second World War, and then their unionist leaders resisting to the very last person introducing a welfare state. It's not just those recent ones, but the one that I love was, they fought and died for Billy at Aughrim in a skill in the Boyne, as we're often told. And what happened was the penal laws were brought in, and the penal laws were directed against them as much as nearly as much as against the native Catholics. And so constantly over and over again, they give their all in their terms, and they don't get back what you'd expect them to get. And you sort of think, but I think we quoted it in the book at one point that this statement is supposedly made by Einstein, but he didn't. What is it? Something along the lines, to try something and fail and try it again is a sign of stupidity or madness, or something like that. There's a sense of madness in that politics, that repeatedly through the history, you never get the reward for your sacrifice.
But the other side of that I certainly took is I would have had a more traditional Republican reading of if you strip everything bare, that really, if we want to understand what's happened in Ireland over the last 100 years, it's about the British state and the Republican movement. Everything else is kind of epiphenomenal or peripheral. And yet when you go back and look at that, the settler colonial dynamic, you have to say, well, no, it is more complex than that. And sometimes, there are definitely 3 core elements to this colonial nexus, if you like, and part of the process of resolving that means that you have to recognise that they all at times act in an independent way. So a lot of the things that happened in the 6 counties, for example, weren't necessarily in the interests of the British imperial state. It's not really the way that they wanted the game to play out. So some of that dynamic is a specifically settler colonial dynamic, which seems sometimes odd to us, but then you go, well, no, look at America. You get exactly the same thing. But the polity that emerged out of them fighting a war of independence wasn't freedom for African Americans or Native Americans. It was a white settler polity that continues to carry the legacy of that settler colonialism to this very day. So again, the broad colonial context helps you see some of the particular dynamics that we have to deal with in there.
Cromwell wanted to move the entire Presbyterian population of Antrim down to Tipperary because of their support for Charles in the Civil War.
Yeah.
Now, there would be a very different history.
Yes. But I suppose that's the other thing I found really fascinating is when you point out, this was a new, at the time, the plantation, this was a new method. But then the kind of unintended, unexpected consequences of that for empire, whenever the settlers didn't do as they were expected. But then also how it introduced, and I do want to come back to this later whenever we talk about what does this mean here now, how we go forward. But you quite early on in the book introduced this notion of mestizaje. Can you explain that? Because it feels that that's related to this idea of, the encounter between settler and native.
Right. Short version, mestizaje, Spanish word, means mixedness. And it's a very common word in Latin America, in Spanish speaking Latin America. And it means that the origins of the nation in these in South American states are Creole, descendants of Spanish settlers, black and indigenous. So you get a three-way thing. Now, just put like that, the notion that the nation is composed of these three sets of people sounds like a really liberal, positive way. But actually, in Spanish politics or Latin American politics, it's a much more sinister notion. It's a notion of, it was a retort to 19th century scientific racism, where whiteness was said to be the pinnacle and blackness was at the bottom, and indigeneity was somewhere in between. So here we are, we're black, white, and indigenous. Oh God. We're stuck, we're not white. So instead of saying this is a bad thing, they said, no, the mixedness is good because we are getting to be white. We're getting whiter by the day as we mix all this thing. So it's a really racist, at its worst, a really racist, conservative, non-liberal sort of notion. What we want to do is to take that notion and turn it on its head and say it's actually a really liberating sort of notion, a very positive notion. Instead of getting involved in places like this, colonialized or decolonializing places like this, instead of getting involved in endless arguments of what constitutes a native, what constitutes a settler, is to say, it's all mestizaje, folks. It's all mixed up, right? So it's not about blood. It's not about origin. That's an accident in a sense. That's not the question. The question is, where do you stand? Where do you stand in politics? Where do you stand in progress? And it doesn't give a beep what your origins are in that sense. So we're using the phrase to say we are mixed, and that therefore a realization of that gets us way beyond the stupidity of community relations arguments to say, no, it's much more, there's something much more fundamental and liberating at stake here.
Yeah.
And I guess I would just add to that by saying that I think that I wouldn't want to say that there was necessarily a virtue to this, but it was an inevitability of colonialism that it moved people in all directions around the world. So that kind of mixing, if it hadn't happened before, and certainly it hadn't happened to the degree it happened through different forms of colonisation, it's an inevitable consequence of that colonialism was the only phenomenon that would bring enslaved people to Africa. The Dutch, everyone else is exporting enslaved Africans to North and South America, but the Dutch are bringing in Cape Malays enslaved from its what's now Indonesia, its colonies in the Far East, and as enslaved people into Africa itself. So that just gives you some sense of the huge population movements that are bound up, and the consequence of that is that there's no going back. You can't unpack that. We're all, including Irish people, have been moved around the world by that force, and we all then have to make sense of where do we take that? How does that situate us politically in our contemporary world?
You actually use in the book your own experiences, how you are each, where you come from in a sense and what you've done with that. So Bill, you first and then Robbie.
Well, we've discussed the possibilities of out on ourselves to the whole world, and there's certain niceties that have to be observed for all sorts of reasons. But it's just to say that, you know, from my own point of view, I've got a name that has saved my skin a few times. Bill, Protestant enough. Rolston, Protestant enough. It has helped me in a number of occasions at UDR roadblocks, for example. It has helped me too with the loyalists on one occasion, where a loyalist turned up at my house one night and was very happy to talk to me because he says, "You're one of us." He was very drunk at the time, but still I was glad to get him out. But what I'm saying is that on both sides of my family, my mother was best, and there's another Protestant name. Her grandfather was Protestant, and her father and the other children were brought up Catholic. My father's grandfather was Protestant, and the children were brought up Catholic. So 3 generations back, if you want to go back to the standard procedure, standard labels, 3 generations back, I'm a settler, right? And I still bear a settler name. But that's, that goes back to the point that, should I be expected to be done at the City Hall holding a banner saying, no protocol or whatever, usually spelled wrongly? It's a difficult word they chose, but obviously some of the graffiti, right? No, I have a choice to make then. I can look at my history, I can look at my upbringing, and I can say, this is where I want to stand politically. That's my story.
So mine is slightly different, and I guess in traditional terms more. No, let's unpack even that. Right. So our spelling of the McVeigh is VEIGH, so it's the Catholic spelling, and I never have been able to find it, because if you kind of go back as far as you can in terms of my family, they're all would definitely would take all the boxes for being like the best of Ulster Scots, proper Presbyterians, but the spelling I don't know. So the spelling injects a wee bit of, you're kind of going, well, where did that come from? Is that just a mistake? Is there something else going on? And then I suppose on the other side of my family, they were much more kind of middle class and Church of Ireland, but very definitely Irish Protestant. So as far as I know, as far back as we can go, like I'm a proper, proper Protestant on both sides. But when you begin to look at the politics of Mr. Yahi and the mixedness point, for me, I still think it's probably the most striking thing about Irish anti-imperialism as a kind of theory or a development of thinking, is that in Ireland, maybe more than anywhere else, you had progressive elements in North America. You had quite a lot of progressive white people obviously involved in the liberation struggle in South Africa. But in Ireland, at a particular moment, it's settler colonialism that generates the philosophy of Irish anti-imperialism. It says this is what it's about, and at that stage it's much more in advance of what's happening in America at that time. It's not just about white settlers going, well, we could run this gaff for ourselves and continue to enjoy the privileges that we have vis-a-vis Native Americans and African Americans. It's saying we can envisage a different form of Irishness that includes all of us. So if you're thinking about one contribution that we've made to the world movement, it's the ability to think that an anti-imperialism that comes out of settler colonialism should be capable of thinking itself into a much broader and more progressive space. So that notion of the common name of Irish person remains as revolutionary as it was 200 years ago, and at least in part that Protestant settler colonial population of Ireland can be very proud that they reached that stage. They didn't just go, well, we'll keep this for ourselves and see if we can mimic the United States. They actually imagined a different, much more progressive, egalitarian space, and that's wonderful. But it also then allows people like me to go, well, I don't have to be remarkable to think myself into this space. Yeah. Ordinary Protestants in the north of Ireland did it 200 years ago, so it's not that hard a step to take now.
Yeah, and you really do draw out, do you know what I mean, that everything that the United Irish movement meant, I think, very powerfully. Before we then talk about, because I do want to talk about the arc of decolonisation. And I want to talk about, contemporary developments, the way you talk about Europe and stuff. But just one of the things I was really struck by is the way that you analyse the Act of Union in a way that, I haven't quite come across before. It feels to me that you paid quite a bit of attention to that, again, as, the way you describe it, as one way that it could be looked at is it was Ireland brought right into the centre of power. But what did it really mean, and what did that new configuration mean for Ireland?
Robbie, you go with that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's a very, very complex question, and I suppose the thing that at least started that discussion for us is the sense that at that point we begin to deviate from most other colonial stories, like the notion that you're brought into the heart of empire. For many people, just becomes, well, that's when colonialism in Ireland ends, because quite clearly you're now part of the mothership of empire, so you can't be colonised anymore. We obviously see it in a slightly different way. I think for me, if you're looking for a sort of a very tangible way of making sense of why that analysis doesn't work, is you go back and you look at the process of the discussion around the Act of Union. That obviously happens after the defeat of the United Irish Movement. It happens in a context in which the British Empire is terrified that it's going to lose this key part of empire. And again, if you look at it now, it looks like, well, why did they care so much? But the population of Ireland at that time was probably 8 million. The population of North America, which they just thought lost, was 4 million. So you kind of get some sense of how history changes that thing, and the fact that our contemporary population remains so low is not connected to that colonial history as well. And I suppose that, like I was saying, if you're looking for a tangible example of why that continued to be a colonial process, is that none of us who weren't men and middle and aristocratic and Protestant ever voted for that Act of Union. So everybody who didn't belong to those three boxes had no role in making the decision to become involved in the union. But for me, it's kind of the striking thing about that is you have this population of 8 or 9 million people co-opted into both union and empire, and yet within a generation, 2 million of them disappear either directly through starvation or related death and emigration. So anyone who wants to apologise for empire from a contemporary perspective has to address, in terms of Ireland, has to address that history. It's kind of, if it was such a good thing to be brought into union and empire, how was it possible that 2 million citizens or subjects of that formation were allowed to disappear? How is it possible that you can have a calculus that suggests that was a good thing, because it clearly wasn't, and again, if you begin to look at that question in a wider context, it's really, really striking, that as you look over the history of constructions of empire, particularly the British Empire, people go, well, it was pretty bad earlier on, but then it got better and better, and brought in industrial development and introduced the concept of democracy. Lots of countries now, it didn't do that, but that's the kind of defence. But even right at the end of the empire, you have, in the middle of the Second World War, you have 3 million people starving to death in the Bengal famine. That's only possible in a colonial context. So it's not unsurprising that contemporary Indians would look at that history and go, well, the Second World War was a terrible experience for people in the United Kingdom. Of course it was. 350,000 people died as soldiers, and approaching 100,000 people died as civilians because of the war. But compare that to the 3 million plus Indians who died as part of that same structure at that time. You kind of get some sense of the inability to actually look at empire in their eye.
There's another element in it too, to answer your question, and I don't want to make it sound too flippant, but that old phrase about better to have somebody inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in. 1798 did rattle the cages of empire, definitely. And there really was no further rattling for a long time to come. For example, Robert Emmet, the last kick of the United Irish Movement, 1848, the Young Islanders. who were capable only of what John Mitchell termed a sad abortion of a revolution. You know, he even called it that, and he was one of the leaders. So it's only like later with the Fenians and the IRB, and finally, a century later, you start to get a real challenge to empire again. Now that came about by that counterinsurgency move of incorporation. Right? So just as plantation was an attempt at counterinsurgency, the Act of Union was an attempt at counterinsurgency, partition was an attempt at counterinsurgency. Each time the notion was that what we can do is we can make it easy for ourselves as the imperial power to have that place, to keep that place, and to not be troubled day in, day out by it. To me, I see that trend running through it all. So it was the price to pay for incorporation.
So bringing us into partition, which is, I think you describe it as the kind of that last policy intervention of colonialism. Talk about the significance of that.
Well, partition was seen by most people in Ireland at the time as a disaster. It was seen by the Unionists of Ireland as, if not quite a disaster, at least not what they wanted. It was a second best. It was, consolation prize in a sense. So in that funny sort of way, it was a little bit like the Act of Union. There was no real push, for the most part, over decades and decades and decades to have partition as the best possible solution. I should add, by the way, incidentally, that in relation to the Act of Union, sorry, I should have thrown this in earlier, Cornwallis, who had lost America, his consolation prize was he was sent to control Ireland and to bring in the Act of Union, and he complained that he'd never dealt with such a corrupt, lying group of blackguards as the Irish Protestant ascendancy. He had to spend a fortune buying their votes. It was a huge con, the Act of Union. Sorry. So back to partition. Disaster, or second best as far as the Unionists were concerned, that settled into some sort of taking over. But it's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight, but there were people saying all the way that this is not peace, this is not conflict resolution, to use the phrase of today. This is going to jump up and bite us all again. Now, the partition argument, when it finally found its legs and started running in the different Home Rule bills, centred around a whole pile of possible options. One was the county option, which was to allow each county to opt out of Home Rule if they wanted to. Another one was a 4-county Ulster option, which was briefly looked at as a possibility. The 9-county Ulster option was also briefly considered too, and we all know why that one wasn't chosen, because it would not have given what they wanted, which was, quote, a Protestant majority in perpetuity. But there's another element of partition which makes it a disaster, and I will credit Robbie with coming up with this way of putting it. And do you know what you're talking about? You were talking about the public democracy. Do you want to speak a bit about that?
Well, I mean, there's a longer perspective on why, particularly British unionists, might not want an independent Ireland, and one of the characterizations of this was it would become a public democracy, and this is a kind of it's a very striking reference to what's wrong with democracy. It's like sometimes democracy is okay, but if it took this character, then there would be something very, very malign about it, and I suppose it's this notion, if you jump across history, you suddenly pick up really important lessons. For me, when you begin to look at contemporary Northern Ireland, the demographic shift that we talk about quite a lot in the book, there's obviously Republicans would want the outcome of this to be a republic, but it is equally, or let's say not equally possible, it is at least theoretically possible that what you do is you have a new Northern Ireland with a Catholic majority which continues to be unionist and see it, and that's precisely would be the published democracy model that that Cornwallis was so worried about, you know. And the problem for us, of course, is that I would suspect it wouldn't be a kind of progressive egalitarian, forward-thinking, anti-imperialist formation that we would want coming out of our history. But it's you know, it is a possibility.
And can I just add that if you do look through the second half of the 19th century in Ireland, you do get progressive advancement of politics and policy, and increasingly you get the breakdown in reality of the Protestant ascendancy, because you begin to get Catholics in high places, Catholics running this, that, and the other. It's starting to become a Popish democracy, and yet the world doesn't fall apart. You know, it continues to be imperialist. That's one of the most remarkable things that I found out in the book. How almost every important Irish nationalist of the second half of the 19th century was pro-empire, right? But they just wanted to run their bit of the empire for themselves. But the point is that what partition did, and this is the disaster partition from our point of view, is that it pushed the clock back. It created the Protestant ascendancy again. The Protestant ascendancy that was almost dead by that point was recreated in hyper form in the north, and that's the tragedy.
Yeah, and in that sense, it is a very bizarre colonial formation in the sense that it's only really Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa took the what seemed like the inevitable transition towards independence in a completely reactionary and settler colonial direction. But we fit in with those two models, and it means that all the contemporary politics that we have to deal with emerges from that dynamic.
The other thing you say, and I think probably need to unpack it a bit as well, is that in 1922, the 26 county state, became a white dominion. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Well, there's a narrow and a wider definition. I'll give you the narrow one first. Is that white dominion was the colloquial construction of those dominions of the British Empire, which were gradually, in a kind of reformist way, working towards some form of independence. Now, at the time of partition, they were only starting on that journey. Places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, which is a crucial example for me, because they were all constructed as white dominions. So it meant that you had a white settler population which was now capable of running its own affairs, and that the empire was kind of prepared to tolerate that development. What's most interesting about South Africa, of course, is that it also was constructed as a white dominion, but the vast majority of its population was black. So the notion of white dominion is quite clearly not a democratic politics. So it's not a commitment towards democracy and informal colonies. It's saying this is the way that settler colonial advantages and entitlement can be reproduced in a new form, and that's why it's so striking if you begin to look at Ireland in that terms. Now, in Ireland, quite clearly that is the sort of the form of political settlement that emerged from the War of Independence and the Civil War. That the status that was given to the Free State was not a republic. I mean, that obviously the split in the Republican movement happened around that very specific issue, but it was they were saying you can have a limited form of autonomy, but that autonomy must be within empire, and the model that we give you is that of the white dominions of, as I say, Canada, Australia, South Africa. So at that very moment, you kind of see that, well, whatever it was, it definitely wasn't a republic. We kind of know that, but it wasn't democratic, and it certainly didn't fit most notions of what self-determination or independence should look like for any formal colony.
And the proof of the pudding was in the eating, as it turned out. And that if you look at the period, around the turn of the 20th century, and all this coming together of the progressive forces that our James Connolly here delighted in, and he claimed that partition would smash that amalgam of progressive forces, and he was totally right. So you've got all sorts of great things happening. You've got internationalism and not just nationalism. You've got the likes of Maud Gonne forming societies of support for Indian independence. You've got Countess Markievicz allegedly plotting to try to spring an Indian nationalist from a jail in England. They're just minor things, but so many connections that It was in many ways not an inward-looking progressiveness. It was a global anti-imperialist progressiveness that was formed around their feminists, Republicans, socialists, trade unionists, and others at that point in time. Now, switch forward, post 1922, switch forward into the Free State and ask yourself, where did that go? Where does this new polity stand? Is this new polity, for example, out on the barricades supporting the independence of African nations? Is it, setting up an early version of a Black Lives Matter international movement or whatever? With some notable exceptions, in the 50s in particular, the answer is no, it wasn't. It became part of the white empire, the white Commonwealth as it became. Its progressiveness was lost along with the revolution. And that's to be retrieved, let's put it that way.
Work in progress.
Yeah.
I suppose whenever I was reading that part of the book, it reminded me of, the history books I read where, we talk about the treaty debates, and it just sort of seemed so trivial that, the whole debate was about the oath of allegiance, right? And that's one way of putting it. It all came down to the oath of allegiance, and is that, what does that, I don't mean exactly what does that matter, but do you know what I mean, to reduce it to that one issue. Whereas the way you talk about it is, it's the choice between the white dominion status, along with Australia, Canada, all the other places, where all that is based on racism, and between the progressive ideals.
Exactly, of an anti-imperialist republic, that's entirely right. I suppose the other thing that we also need to throw into the mix is that, again, it kind of, you have to think twice when you read back in history, but the most significant point for me is that the first time that Irish people had that voice to decide do we want empire or do we want republic was the 1918 general election. It also was the last time when the whole of Ireland had that choice, and people made the decision very clearly. So I kind of, again, when we fast forward to some of the debates around the border poll, people think this is such a wonderful idea. For me, it's not the real mechanism. If you look at your own history, we made a decision in 1918. The key question is, how do the two partition bits of Ireland, recombine in a context of a decision that they took over 100 years ago now, which was to reject empire and to support the notion of a new progressive republic.
So, and that was a decision that was thwarted. Do you know it was made, but it was thwarted. You talk about the foundational documents. Can you just remind us what those were? I have written down here.
So you've
proclamation
itself, obviously, but the Declaration of Independence and
Democratic.
The Democratic Programme.
Okay, so what can we learn from those?
Well, sometimes it's symbolic, but no less important for that. We use the phrase a number of times. I don't know, Robbie's used this an awful lot in his work about racism and anti-racism in Ireland. The notion of cherishing all the children of the nation equally. I mean, that's in there from the very start. And it's such an evocative sort of phrase. And if you really, really believed in it, how much difference would it make to so many people's lives, whether it's migrants seeking asylum, or homeless people on the street, or women who are second-class citizens or whatever, if cherishing all the children of the nation equally was truly at the centre of politics here. The democratic programme of the Dáil, the second Dáil, was very, very progressive in international terms and in socialist terms. And a lot of what happened afterwards meant that this could never be enacted, because they get down to not just the nitty-gritty of running a state for Britain, or for empire, but also the nitty-gritty of taking on their former comrades in a gruesome civil war, so that you've got the likes of Kevin O'Higgins referring to these documents basically as poetry. Mostly poetry. They're nice, they're nice gestures now, but I mean, real politics doesn't allow you to go down that road. And I think part of what we're saying is that if you really were serious about these documents, you could, even without writing a different constitution or anything, you could have a very imaginative retake on what this island would look like.
Well, it's certainly where we should start the discussion. I think like we've done this once. Like it was done with the democratic mandate of the Irish people. So there's a starting point for how we have these discussions north and south, and with the diaspora as well.
Can you just briefly say, because I think we need to say something about it, it's that checkered record of, the 26 county state, right? Sometimes it feels like you were saying, progressive things were, well, certainly there's been change, social change, sometimes in terms of international solidarity, but it's been a sort of a checkered record. But tell me, the mistake I think that I see you point out in terms of retaining that link to kind of like, or configuring the Irish population as white Irish, in a sense, as part of European, being, part of the European identity, and what trajectory happened there, and what we need to do to come.
Well, there's a key thread that runs through post-partition politics in the South. This progressive period around the time of Connolly and all, where you can see internationalism and really wonderful politics express itself, albeit in a minor key, given everything else that's happened. If you look at what the anti-treaty Sinn Féiners were at when they realised, they hadn't a mission here anymore, they put an awful lot of their effort into international politics, freedom of India and various other causes like that. If you look through then to the 1950s with the Department of Foreign Affairs, Frank Aiken in particular, and his interventions in the United Nations, Ireland had a great reputation in the United Nations as an early member of the United Nations, of being pro-Algerian independence, pro-China, being a member of the United Nations, anti-Western intervention in Afghanistan, and so on and so on and so on. Now, it's, as I said, it's a minor key, and everything else is working against it, and it's great that the spark keeps lit, but it seems to me where the spark gets, I don't know if it's totally muffled altogether, or smothered altogether, but it's with the European Union, because now foreign policy becomes this collective notion that there's a European approach to how we do these things. And remember, many of these European nations, for all their progressiveness in relation to social rights, women's rights, whatever, anti-racism, they are still colonizers. There are still, how many did we work out, or you worked it out? How many? There are a number of colonies still in the hands of France.
Oh, it's all these little micro. There's 20 or 30. Well, once the UK left, about half of them left with the UK. There's still 15 small micropolities that are colonial legacies.
So that's where the minor key becomes almost inaudible.
But I think, the other bit of that questioning of whiteness, I think is both more profound but also more problematic, perhaps, in the sense that I think if you follow through the logic of what we're saying, is that the kind of rush to embrace whiteness, even in the sense of saying, there's people need to feel very guilty about being white, is very problematic in an Irish context. We've had, as Ignatius said, in the States, whiteness thrust upon you in the States as a way of becoming a citizen of America. But really, in the island of Ireland, you have whiteness thrust upon you by an empire which is disengaging through white dominion, and all the reactionary politics that came out of the 26 county state are at least framed by that moment. That's the white dominion sets the tone for the kind of politics that are going to emerge south of the border over the last 100 years. So, in my opinion, we've enough to be guilty about in terms of what Irish people have done within empire. So we don't really need to the notion that we take on the mantle of whiteness is really problematic. Which is not to say that we we suggest that most white people are people of colour, because they're not either. Like, but that space of whiteness is not one that we particularly want to be in, and should be very careful about embracing, even when we're kind of being critical of racism. So it's really intriguing that, whenever Boris Johnson sponsors the Sale Commission as a response to Black Lives Matter, they come up with this really dangerous concept of the UK being a white majority country. It's the first time ever you kind of see this notion operationalised in a political sense, and somebody who was so adept at using Brexit in that kind of majoritarian way will undoubtedly use that in a further racialisation of UK politics. But in the 6 counties, we have to remember we're part of that construction. Like he's saying, this is a white majority country, and you are all part of it. Like, all you Republicans and Nationalists and everybody else are now part of this white majority. So it's a really, really dangerous thing to kind of assume that whiteness is just a given. It's not. It's a political.
Because construct. Remember, for most of the period we've been talking about, most of this history, the Irish were not white, or not quite white. They were not seen as white, and so it might seem, someone listening to this might say, I don't get that, you all look white, don't you? But we're not just talking about this, we're talking about the politics of race and racism. And for most of the history, we're talking about the Irish were seen as not white. And so the confirmation of the Free State was, now that we're truly white, and Boris then has confirmed that we're white too. That's nice.
There's a lovely quote you have. I can't remember who said it, but treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity.
That's Ignatieff.
Okay.
No, Ignatieff.
Is there anything, because there's so much we're having to draw to an end, and I really had wanted to talk about the good relations state and all of that, but what you are saying is there's nothing, this is transformational time, moment, period. There's nothing inevitable about progress to progressive, inclusive, internationalist, anti-imperialist. So kind of final comments around that.
I would say that, and I don't want to exaggerate here, but in a sense, for the first time in over 100 years and over a century, we're back at something that looks a little bit like the possibilities that Conley was talking about. A sort of coming together, not a merger by any means, but a coming together of progressive forces over a whole lot of issues, but that all lead to some sort of different end from the one that we're in currently. Now that could be opposition to Brexit, it could be opposition to all sorts of things, So I that's why we're actually, for all the gloom and doom in the book, we call the book HACKETT, Now the Summer's Coming. And we do believe that there is a very optimistic potential in the current period. It's not like saying, let's throw all the cards up in the air and we're about to get something better than now. It's not that sort of chaotic type of notion, but the notion that a lot of the ducks are lining up in some sort of row here, and there are good signs, not inevitable signs, but good signs that we can get it together better than we've been doing for the last century.
Yeah, I would just echo that, but I suppose that again, as we said right at the start, things have moved very quickly over the last 5 or 6 years, and I think, without overstating it, we are at a remarkable revolutionary moment, if you like, where for lots of different reasons there's a chance to go back and have these discussions again. And I think the most dangerous, if you want to draw one lesson from our book, is that the most dangerous outcome of this would be to try and shoehorn the 6 counties into the white dominion model of the 26 counties. That's not going to work for anyone. What we have to do is accept what Conley said. There would be a carnival of reaction either side of the border. Let's build something different and transformative that's based on a real commitment to self-determination for the whole island.
Thank you.
Good night.